My dearest, will you do me the honor of becoming my wife?
I truly thought no duke would ever choose me.
Yes.
What if the most powerful man in London offered you his title, his fortune, and his name, not after a season of romantic courtship, but between the roasted pheasant and the candied violets? It sounds like a drawing room fairy tale. But for Miss Beatrice, it was the beginning of a brilliant, dangerous scandal. London in the spring of 1814 was a city drunk on victory and champagne. With the Emperor Napoleon exiled to Elba, the aristocracy had descended upon Mayfair with a ravenous appetite for celebration, scandal, and matrimony. But inside the glittering, candlelit drawing room of Sally Jersey, the formidable Lady Jersey, a patroness of Almack's and the undisputed queen of the ton, Miss Beatrice Linfield, felt entirely invisible. At 26, Beatrice had long ago passed from the hopeful bloom of a debutante into the invisible realm of the confirmed spinster. She possessed no grand fortune, no towering aristocratic connections, and a face that was altogether too sharp and intelligent to be deemed fashionably angelic. Her father, the late Baron of Oakhaven, had gambled away the family's modest wealth on terrible investments in the West Indies, leaving Beatrice and her widowed mother with little more than an unblemished name and a terrifying mountain of hidden debts. Tonight, Beatrice was wearing a gown of deep emerald silk that had been relentlessly altered for 3 consecutive seasons. She stood near a massive arrangement of hothouse lilies, nursing a glass of watered-down ratafia and observing the predatory dance of the marriage mart. "Look at them," whispered her closest confidant, Miss Charlotte Bingley, gesturing discreetly with her ivory fan toward the center of the room. "The vultures are circling. I heard Lady Cowper nearly trampled her own footman to ensure her daughter was standing near the door when he arrived." Beatrice's lips twitched into a wry smile. "Can you blame her? He is a duke, Charlotte, and not just any duke. He is the Duke of Roxley. I imagine one does not simply greet a man with an income of 100,000 a year. One orchestrates a military campaign. The man in question was His Grace, Nathaniel Hastings, the Duke of Roxley. He had just entered the drawing room, an imposing figure of broad shoulders, tailored midnight blue superfine, and an expression of profound, terrifying boredom. He was a man of the shadows, despite his dazzling rank. Whispers followed him like ghosts. It was known he had spent the war years on the continent doing highly classified, dangerous work for Lord Wellesley, the Duke of Wellington. Roxley was not a man of poetry and picnics. He was a man of steel, secrets, and ruthlessness. "They say he is finally looking for a duchess." Charlotte sighed, her eyes tracking the Duke's slow, deliberate progress across the Axminster carpet. "He requires an heir. Arabella Montgomery has been practicing her curtsy for a week. She is convinced she will be the one." Beatrice let out a soft, melodic laugh, a sound of genuine amusement that cut through the stifling, perfumed air of the room. "Arabella Montgomery has the intellect of a decorative porcelain spaniel. The Duke looks as though he would rather eat glass than engage in polite conversation about the weather." "Perhaps he will choose a dark horse," Charlotte suggested playfully. "Perhaps he will choose you, Bee." Beatrice laughed again, shaking her head. The very idea was preposterous, a comedic farce. "Oh, please. Men of his station do not marry women of mine. They marry land, titles, and political alliances. I am a penniless baron's daughter in a recycled gown. No duke would ever choose me," she laughed, her voice carrying a cynical but entirely unbothered warmth. "I would bet my last shilling he will propose to some vapid earl's daughter before the season is out. A dangerous wager, Miss Linfield." The voice was low, resonant, and possessed the texture of rough velvet. It came from directly behind her. Beatrice froze. The blood drained from her face, only to rush back in a mortifying wave of heat. She turned slowly. Nathaniel Hastings, the Duke of Roxley, was standing mere inches away. Up close, he was even more intimidating. His eyes were not a fashionable, poetic blue, but a dark, turbulent slate gray. There was a small, faded scar cutting through the rugged line of his jaw, a souvenir from a French cavalry saber at Vittoria, or so the rumors claimed. He was looking down at her, not with the expected aristocratic disdain, but with a sharp, calculating intensity that made Beatrice's breath hitch in her throat. Charlotte let out a strangled squeak and dropped into a terrified curtsy before fleeing toward the safety of the dowagers. Beatrice, drawing on every ounce of her pride, lifted her chin and met the Duke's gaze. She curtsied, her movements precise. "Your Grace, I apologize. I did not realize my private conversation was being audited." "Clearly," Nathaniel murmured, his gaze sweeping over her face. He didn't look at her outdated gown or her lack of jewels. He looked directly into her eyes. "You have a remarkably low opinion of my intelligence, Miss Linfield, if you believe I would shackle myself to a porcelain spaniel." Beatrice swallowed hard, her heart hammering against her ribs. "I only meant that men of your rank have obligations, Your Grace. Romantic sensibilities are rarely a factor in ducal marriages." "On that we agree entirely," Nathaniel said softly. A strange, dangerous shadow flickered in his slate-gray eyes. "Romance is a fiction invented by poets to sell books. Marriage is a transaction, a matter of survival." Before Beatrice could dissect that bizarrely intense statement, the booming voice of Lady Jersey's major domo announced that dinner was served. Nathaniel held her gaze for a fraction of a second longer, a look that felt distinctly like an appraisal. "Do not be so certain of what a duke would or would not choose, Miss Linfield. You might find your wagers lost." With a brief, formal bow, he turned and walked away, leaving Beatrice standing by the lilies, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her corset. The dining room of the Jersey townhouse was a masterpiece of Regency excess. The long mahogany table was laden with heavy silver candelabras, crystal épergne overflowing with exotic fruits, and the finest Sèvres porcelain. Beatrice had expected to be seated at the very far end of the table, somewhere between a deaf vicar and a minor, impoverished cousin. Instead, as the guests found their place cards, she realized with a jolt of pure panic that she was seated directly in the center of the table. To her left was Lord Castlereagh, the powerful Foreign Secretary. And to her right, occupying the seat of honor, was the Duke of Roxley. Across the table, the beautiful and extraordinarily wealthy Miss Arabella Montgomery looked as though she had just swallowed a lemon whole. As Beatrice took her seat, her emerald silk rustling softly, she glanced at Nathaniel. He was staring straight ahead, his profile carved from granite. "Did you orchestrate this, Your Grace?" Beatrice asked in a furious whisper as the footman began to serve the first course, a rich, steaming turtle soup. "I am a duke, Miss Linfield," Nathaniel replied, picking up his silver spoon. "I orchestrate everything." "Why?" Nathaniel finally turned to look at her. The harsh candlelight threw the sharp angles of his face into deep relief. "Because you are the only woman in this room who is not actively plotting to ensnare me. And because you are remarkably observant. I need a pair of sharp eyes tonight." Beatrice paused, her spoon hovering over her bowl. The tone of his voice had changed. The aristocratic drawl was gone, replaced by the clipped, urgent cadence of a military commander. "Eyes for what?" "Eat your soup, Miss Linfield, and tell me what you see when you look at Lord Castlereagh's private secretary, sitting 3 seats down on the opposite side." Beatrice casually lifted her spoon to her lips, letting her gaze drift across the table. The man in question, Mr. Thomas Highsmith, was a pale, nervous-looking gentleman in his 30s. He was not eating. His hands were resting in his lap, but Beatrice could see his shoulders twitching. Every few seconds, his eyes darted toward the grand mahogany doors of the dining room. He looked like a rabbit caught in the shadow of a hawk. "He is terrified," Beatrice murmured softly, leaning slightly toward the Duke to avoid being overheard over the din of polite conversation. "He hasn't touched his soup. He is sweating, despite the draft in the room. And he keeps looking at the door, as if he is expecting an executioner." "Excellent," Nathaniel murmured. "You are exactly as astute as Wellesley claimed your father was." Beatrice stiffened. "You knew my father?" "I knew of him. A brilliant mind for ciphers, entirely wasted on bad investments." Nathaniel took a slow sip of his wine. "Highsmith is terrified because he is carrying a letter in his breast pocket. A letter that outlines the exact movements of British naval assets in the Mediterranean. If that letter leaves this house tonight and reaches the French sympathizers hiding in London, thousands of men could die. Beatrice felt the room tilt sideways. The clatter of silver, the trilling laughter of Lady Jersey, the scent of roasted meats, it all suddenly felt incredibly surreal. You are speaking of treason. Why tell me? Why not have him arrested? Because Highsmith is a pawn, Nathaniel said quietly, his gaze fixed on his plate. The person he is passing the letter to is in this room, someone of high rank, someone untouchable without absolute proof. I cannot arrest Highsmith without knowing who the puppet master is. The second course arrived turbot in lobster sauce. Beatrice stared at the delicate fish. Her appetite completely vanished. She was a spinster from a ruined family, concerned only with surviving the season without completely embarrassing herself. Now, she was sitting beside a spy, discussing high treason over fish. "And what does this have to do with me?" she asked, her voice remarkably steady despite the chaos in her mind. "I need a distraction, a shield," Nathaniel replied. A footman approached, bending low to pour more wine into the Duke's glass. As he did, the footman seamlessly slipped a small folded piece of paper onto the table, directly next to Nathaniel's hand. Nathaniel didn't blink. He casually covered the note with his palm, sliding it off the table and into his lap. Beatrice watched the maneuver with wide eyes. "Excuse me for a moment," Nathaniel murmured. He uncreased the note beneath the table, glancing down just long enough to read the contents. When he looked back up, the color had completely drained from his face. The legendary stoicism of the Duke of Roxley cracked, revealing a man backed into a desperate corner. "What is it?" Beatrice whispered, alarmed by the sudden, visceral tension radiating from him. "They have changed the terms," Nathaniel said, his voice so low she had to lean in to hear him. The scent of sandalwood and danger clung to him. "The mastermind is not just after naval secrets. They know about my sister," Beatrice gasped softly. The scandal of Lady Georgiana Hastings had been the most fiercely guarded secret of the ton. Rumors had swirled years ago that she had eloped with a French officer, but the family had claimed she died of consumption in Italy. "She is alive," Nathaniel confirmed grimly, reading the shock on Beatrice's face. "And she is being held in a safe house in Calais. The mastermind in this room is offering a trade. The naval cipher for my sister's safe return." "Then you must give it to them," Beatrice said instantly. "If I do, the Mediterranean fleet burns. If I do not, my sister will be executed before the week is out." Nathaniel's jaw clenched so hard Beatrice thought his teeth might shatter. "There is only one way to maneuver. The blackmailer demands I marry their chosen pawn by special license to secure an alliance to prove my loyalty to their cause. If I am wed to their agent, they release Georgiana. If I refuse, or if I attempt to leave this dinner without finalizing the betrothal, they send the order to kill her." "Who is their pawn?" Beatrice asked, her blood running cold. Nathaniel subtly tilted his head toward the other side of the table. "Miss Arabella Montgomery. Her family has deep, hidden ties to the Bourbon remnants and Bonaparte loyalists. If I offer for her tonight, I secure my sister's life, but I bind the Roxley fortune and political influence to a treasonous syndicate forever." Beatrice stared at the beautiful, vapid Arabella. It was a perfect, diabolical trap. "Then what will you do?" Beatrice asked, her voice trembling slightly. Nathaniel turned his dark, intense gaze fully upon her. "I will do what I always do, Miss Linfield. I will outmaneuver them. I cannot leave this room unbetrothed, or my sister dies. I cannot marry Arabella Montgomery, or the country bleeds." The third course, roasted venison and buttered asparagus, was being cleared away. The tension in the dining room was thick enough to choke on. At the far end of the table, Arabella Montgomery was smiling smugly, clearly anticipating something momentous. "Miss Linfield," Nathaniel said, his voice dropping to a hypnotic, dangerous register. "Earlier this evening you laughed and said no duke would ever choose you." The grand dining room, with its 70 guests and echoing chatter, suddenly felt as intimate and suffocating as a locked vault. Beatrice stared at Nathaniel, her intellect struggling to catch up with the terrifying implication of his words. "You cannot be serious," she whispered, her hands gripping the edge of the mahogany table. I have never been more serious in my life, Nathaniel replied. His slate-gray eyes locked onto hers with a ferocity that made her skin prickle. I need a wife. Immediately. Someone whose background is unimpeachable, whose loyalty to the crown is absolute, and who possesses the intelligence to survive the political warfare that is about to erupt. I am a spinster with no dowry and a mountain of inherited debt, Beatrice hissed, trying to keep her panic from drawing the attention of the surrounding guests. Lady Jersey was already casting curious glances in their direction from the head of the table. Your father's debts are a pittance, Nathaniel dismissed smoothly. I will pay them before breakfast. I will secure your mother's estate. You will have the title of Duchess, an unlimited allowance, and the absolute protection of my name. No one in London will ever dare look down on you again. And in exchange? Beatrice demanded, her practical nature clawing its way through the shock. What do I give you? You give me a way out of this trap, Nathaniel said. If I announce my betrothal to you right now, before the dessert is served, the blackmailer's plan is shattered. I fulfill the condition of becoming engaged, proving I am not acting aggressively against them tonight, which buys me the 72 hours I need to extract my sister from Calais. But I do not bind myself to their syndicate. They will be thrown into chaos, trying to determine if you are a hidden player or simply a random variable. They will target me, Beatrice realized, the terrifying truth sinking in like a stone in a freezing pond. I will not let them touch you, Nathaniel promised. And for the first time, the cold, calculating Duke sounded fiercely, genuinely human. You will have a dozen of my best men guarding you day and night. But I need to know, Beatrice, will you do it? Will you marry me? Before Beatrice could answer, a shadow fell over their section of the table. It was Lady Caroline Fitzroy, a woman known for her vicious tongue and her desperate, long-standing ambition to become the Duchess of Roxley. She had left her seat and glided over under the pretense of admiring the floral centerpiece. Your Grace, Lady Caroline purred, resting a possessive hand on the back of Nathaniel's chair, glaring down at Beatrice. You have been monopolizing poor Miss Linfield all evening. Really, it is quite cruel to tease the girl, so we all know a woman of her vintage and station is easily confused by the attentions of her betters. Beatrice felt a familiar, sickening wave of humiliation wash over her. It was the same condescension she had endured for 6 years. The constant reminder that she was less than, that she was invisible, that she was a joke to women like Caroline and Arabella. She looked at Lady Caroline's sneering face. Then she looked across the table at Arabella Montgomery, who was watching them with a smug, knowing smile, fully believing she was about to secure the most powerful man in England through blackmail and blood. Beatrice's pragmatism, her fear, and her hesitation vanished, replaced by a sudden, blazing fire. She had spent her entire life shrinking to make others comfortable. She had laughed at her own expense to beat them to the punch. No duke would ever choose me, she had said. She turned her gaze back to Nathaniel. He was watching her, waiting. He wasn't looking at her with pity or condescension. He was looking at her like she was the most vital person in the world. He was looking at her as an equal. Are you certain my vintage is suitable, Your Grace? Beatrice asked, her voice clear, calm, and carrying just enough volume to ensure Lady Caroline heard every word. Nathaniel's lips curved into a devastating, breathtaking smile. It transformed his face completely. Your vintage, Miss Linfield, is the only one I have any interest in possessing. He stood up. The sudden movement caught the attention of the entire room. The clatter of silverware ceased. The murmurs died down. 70 pairs of eyes turned toward the center of the table. Lord Castlereagh paused midway through a sip of port. Lady Jersey froze, her fan half opened. Nathaniel reached down and took Beatrice's hand. His grip was warm, strong, and completely anchoring. He pulled her gently to her feet. Lady Jersey, Nathaniel's voice rang out, authoritative and absolute, commanding the silence of the room. My lords, ladies, I apologize for interrupting the flow of this magnificent evening, but I find myself entirely unwilling to wait another moment. Across the room, the pale secretary, Mr. Highsmith, dropped his napkin. Arabella Montgomery sat up straight, her triumphant smile faltering. Nathaniel turned his body fully toward Beatrice, ignoring the shocked gasps echoing around the dining room. He didn't drop to one knee, he was too proud a creature for that, but he bowed his head slightly, bringing her knuckles to his lips. "Miss Beatrice Linfield," Nathaniel said, his voice loud enough for the blackmailer, the gossips, and the entire British Empire to hear. "You have captivated me entirely. I would be profoundly honored if you would consent to be my wife." The silence that followed was so profound Beatrice could hear the wax dripping from the candelabras. Lady Caroline Fitzroy let out a sound like a strangled cat. Beatrice looked into the slate-gray eyes of the Wolf of London. She saw the danger, the impending scandal, the political warfare, and the desperate gamble he was taking. But beneath it all, she saw something else. She saw a partnership. She squeezed his hand. "Yes, Your Grace," Beatrice said, her voice ringing out clearly, completely devoid of the cynical laughter she usually hid behind. "I will marry you." Just as the words left her lips, the grand doors to the dining room swung open, and an army of footmen marched in, carrying towering silver trays of syllabub, spun, sugar, and candied violets. The dessert had arrived. But for Beatrice, the true feast of chaos was only just beginning. The arrival of the spun sugar and syllabub did nothing to sweeten the explosive shockwave that detonated across Lady Jersey's dining room. Beatrice's acceptance hung in the air, a bell that could not be unrung. For 3 seconds, absolute paralyzed silence reigned. Then pandemonium erupted. Lady Jersey's crystal goblet shattered against her plate. Lord Castlereagh choked on his port, requiring his neighbor to violently clap him on the back. Further down the table, Arabella Montgomery let out a shrill, theatrical shriek and promptly swooned into the arms of a terrified footman, her grand political marriage shattered before it could even begin. Nathaniel did not linger to admire his handiwork. He released Beatrice's hand only long enough to step behind her chair, drawing it back with smooth military precision. "We are leaving," he murmured, his voice a low rumble against her ear, sending a sudden shiver down her spine that had absolutely nothing to do with the drafty room. "Keep your eyes forward, Beatrice. Show them nothing." He offered his arm. She took it, her fingers curling into the dense, immaculate superfine of his sleeve. Together, they navigated the gauntlet of the dining room. Beatrice felt the heat of 70 glares boring into her back, a volatile mixture of envy, outrage, and profound confusion. As they passed Mr. Thomas Highsmith, Beatrice noticed the pale secretary discreetly sliding a second, smaller folded parchment beneath his napkin, his hands trembling violently. Without breaking stride, Nathaniel's free hand swept over the table, palming the hidden parchment with the practiced grace of a seasoned pickpocket. They swept out into the cool, damp air of Mayfair, the heavy front doors of the townhouse closing behind them and cutting off the crescendo of aristocratic hysteria. Nathaniel's private carriage, bearing the crest of the Duke of Roxley, was waiting. The footman pulled down the steps, and Nathaniel handed her inside, his grip firm and protective. As the carriage lurched forward into the foggy London night, the street lamps casting fleeting golden shadows across the plush velvet interior, Beatrice finally released the breath she felt she had been holding since the soup course. "I am ruined," she whispered, the adrenaline receding to leave a cold wash of reality. "By tomorrow morning there will not be a drawing room in London that is not dissecting my family's debts, my age, and my absolute lack of consequence. They will say, 'I bewitched you,' or 'compromised you.'" "Let them talk," Nathaniel said dismissively. He was leaning back against the squabs, his long legs stretched out in the confined space, unbuttoning his waistcoat with a weary sigh. The formidable Duke of Roxley suddenly looked like a soldier who had been fighting a war in the dark for far too long. "Gossip is a weapon of the weak, Beatrice. We have far more lethal enemies to concern ourselves with tonight." He produced the crumpled parchment he had swiped from Highsmith's table setting and flattened it against his knee. It was covered in a chaotic, seemingly random string of letters and numerals. Highsmith was supposed to pass the naval intelligence to Lord Montgomery, Arabella's uncle, Nathaniel explained, his slate-gray eyes scanning the gibberish. "Montgomery is the architect of this blackmail. He is a prominent Whig outwardly, but secretly he has been funneling British gold to Joseph Fouché, the French Minister of Police, to fund a Bonapartist uprising. They want Bonaparte off Elba and back on the throne. They needed the Mediterranean naval routes to ensure the French loyalist fleet could intercept our supply lines. Beatrice leaned closer, the scent of sandalwood and danger intoxicatingly near. And your sister, Georgiana? Montgomery's men intercepted her carriage in Amiens 3 weeks ago. Nathaniel's jaw tightened, the faint scar on his cheek turning white. I received the first ransom demand yesterday. They moved her to Calais. I have a ship waiting in the Channel, commanded by Captain Francis Austin, a brilliant naval officer and a man I trust with my life. But Austin cannot breach the safe house without the exact address and the patrol schedules of the French guards. That information was supposed to be in this second note, handed over in exchange for my betrothal to Arabella. But because you proposed to me instead, Beatrice began. Because I proposed to you, Montgomery panicked. Nathaniel finished. He instructed Highsmith to abort the exchange. This note contains the new orders, but it is encrypted. Nathaniel ran a frustrated hand through his dark hair. I need to get this to the War Office codebreakers at Whitehall immediately. It will take them hours, perhaps a day, to crack it. Time Georgiana does not have. Beatrice stared at the parchment resting on his knee. She leaned forward, her brow furrowing as she recognized the mathematical grouping of the letters. "May I?" she asked, reaching out. Nathaniel hesitated, then handed it to her. "It is a complex substitution cipher, Beatrice. It is not a parlor game." "I know what it is," she murmured, her eyes darting across the lines. "My father was ruined by bad investments, Your Grace. But before his mind faded, he was one of Lord Grenville's chief cryptographers. He taught me to read music, to speak French, and to break a Vigenère square before I was 10. Nathaniel went completely still, watching her with an intensity that burned through the shadows of the carriage. "Can you read it?" "It is a variation of a sliding alphabet," Beatrice muttered, her mind racing, slipping into the familiar, comforting rhythm of mathematical logic. "The key is usually a date or a name." She paused, closing her eyes, visualizing the grid her father had drawn for her 1,000 times. "Look at the frequency of the double letters. If we assume the key is Elba." For 5 agonizing minutes, the only sound in the carriage was the rhythmic clattering of horses' hooves against the cobblestones and Beatrice's soft murmurs as she mentally shifted the alphabet. Suddenly she gasped. She looked up at Nathaniel, her eyes wide. "Rue de la Mer. Number 14. The guard changes at midnight and 4 in the morning. There is a cellar door that leads to the smuggling tunnels." Nathaniel stared at her, utterly astounded. The aristocratic mask was entirely gone, replaced by raw, unfiltered awe. "You are certain?" "Absolutely certain," Beatrice said, handing the paper back. "Driver!" Nathaniel roared, slamming his fist against the carriage roof. "To the docks! Ride as if the devil himself is chasing us!" He turned back to Beatrice, his chest heaving slightly. He looked at her not as a convenient shield, not as a desperate spinster, but as a revelation. He reached out, his large, warm hands gently framing her face. "No duke would ever choose you," Nathaniel repeated her earlier words, his voice thick with a sudden, overwhelming emotion. "My God, Beatrice, I did not choose a wife tonight. I chose a miracle." He kissed her. It was not a polite, aristocratic pressing of lips. It was a fierce, desperate claiming, a collision of adrenaline, fear, and undeniable, scorching attraction. Beatrice gasped into his mouth, her hands instinctively clutching the lapels of his coat as he pulled her closer, the carriage rocking violently beneath them. When they finally broke apart, both were breathless, the air between them crackling with an electricity that terrified and thrilled her in equal measure. "I will send the dispatch to Captain Austin tonight," Nathaniel said, his forehead resting against hers. "By tomorrow evening, Georgiana will be on a ship bound for Dover. But tomorrow, Beatrice, we must face the wrath of London and Lord Montgomery." The next 48 hours were a blur of exquisite gowns, terrifying scrutiny, and lethal political theater. True to his word, Nathaniel had moved flawlessly. He had paid off the Linfield debts before noon, settled a generous estate upon her bewildered mother, and legally bound himself to Beatrice with a special license signed by the Archbishop of Canterbury. They were not yet married, but the betrothal was ironclad. London reacted with predictable viciousness. The morning papers published thinly veiled caricatures of a destitute spinster trapping a wealthy wolf. But when Beatrice appeared on Nathaniel's arm at the grand fete at Carlton House, hosted by the extravagant Prince Regent himself, she was not wearing recycled emerald silk. She was draped in shimmering, silver-threaded muslin, her throat adorned with the legendary Roxley diamonds. She walked with her head high, projecting an aura of untouchable confidence, while Nathaniel remained a dark, lethal presence at her side. "You are magnificent," Nathaniel murmured, passing her a glass of champagne as they stood beneath the glittering chandeliers of the prince's Gothic conservatory. "Lady Cowper has been staring at your necklace for 10 minutes. I believe she might weep." Beatrice smiled, though her heart was hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. It is easy to be magnificent when one is wearing the ransom of a small nation. Your Grace, have we received word from Captain Austen? Nathaniel's smile did not reach his eyes. Not yet. The ship should have docked at Dover 3 hours ago. If the extraction failed, he didn't finish the sentence. "It did not fail," Beatrice said fiercely, stepping closer to him, offering a comforting presence amidst the swirling crowd of silk and deceit. "Austen is the best, and the cipher was correct." Before Nathaniel could reply, a tall, impeccably dressed gentleman stepped into their periphery, blocking their path to the terrace. It was Lord Montgomery. His face was a mask of polite, aristocratic charm, but his eyes were cold and reptilian. "Your Grace, Miss Linfield," Montgomery said, bowing with exaggerated slowness. "A brilliant coup. The entire ton is breathless with your sudden romantic awakening, Roxley, though I confess I am surprised to see you celebrating tonight. I heard a rumor that the climate in Calais is particularly unforgiving this time of year, so prone to tragic accidents." Nathaniel's grip on his crystal glass tightened so violently Beatrice thought it might shatter. He stepped smoothly in front of Beatrice, shielding her with his body. "The climate in Calais is no longer my concern, Montgomery," Nathaniel said softly, a lethal edge in his tone, "though I would advise you to mind the climate here in London. I hear the air around the tower is exceptionally damp, bad for the lungs of traitors." Montgomery's smile vanished, replaced by a sneer of pure malice. He stepped closer, dropping the pretense of politeness. "You think you have outmaneuvered me by marrying this impoverished nobody? By tomorrow morning, the French loyalists will have their naval routes, and your sister will be at the bottom of the channel. You cannot win, Roxley. The old empires are returning." "You are entirely mistaken, Lord Montgomery," Beatrice interjected, her voice cutting through the heavy tension like a silver blade. She stepped out from behind Nathaniel's protective frame, fixing the corrupt lord with a look of withering disdain. Montgomery blinked, startled by her audacity. "Do not speak to me, little girl. You are out of your depth." "Am I?" Beatrice smiled, a sharp, cunning expression that perfectly mirrored her fiancé's. "Then perhaps you should explain why the esteemed Foreign Secretary, Lord Castlereagh, is currently standing by the orchestra, reading a sworn confession from Mr. Thomas Highsmith?" Montgomery froze, the color violently draining from his face. He whipped his head around. Across the crowded ballroom, Castlereagh was indeed holding a thick parchment, looking directly at Montgomery with an expression of grim finality. Two heavily armed King's Guards were quietly making their way through the crowd toward the conservatory. "Highsmith is a coward," Beatrice said pleasantly, taking a delicate sip of her champagne. "When His Grace kindly informed him this morning that he was being manipulated by Fouché's network and offered him immunity in exchange for turning King's evidence against you, he wept like a child and wrote down everything. Your bank drafts, your meetings in the smuggling tunnels, everything." Montgomery took a stumbling step back, his eyes darting frantically toward the exits. "You bluffing harlot." He reached inside his coat, his face twisting into a mask of desperate violence, but Nathaniel moved with blinding speed. The Duke closed the distance in a fraction of a second, his hand clamping around Montgomery's throat, pinning the older man brutally against the marble pillar of the conservatory. "Speak to my future Duchess in that tone again," Nathaniel whispered, his face inches from Montgomery's. "And I will not wait for the crown to hang you. I will break your neck here and now." "Your Grace!" A sharp, authoritative voice cut through the commotion. Sir Charles Stewart, the British diplomat and intelligence coordinator, pushed his way through the gathering crowd of horrified onlookers. In his hand, he held a sealed dispatch rider's pouch. Nathaniel released Montgomery, letting the traitor collapse to the floor just as the king's guards arrived to drag him away. The Duke turned to Sir Charles, his chest heaving, his eyes locked on the pouch. Sir Charles offered a rare, genuine smile. "A message from Dover. Your Grace. Captain Austen sends his regards. The package has been secured. Lady Georgiana is safe on British soil and is currently en route to your country estate under heavy guard." Nathaniel closed his eyes, a profound, shuddering breath escaping his lips. The war was over. The game was won. He turned back to Beatrice. The murmuring crowd, the Prince Regent's lavish fate, the political ramifications, it all faded into absolute insignificance. He walked toward her, ignoring the stares of the ton, and took both of her hands in his. "It seems, Miss Linfield, that you have saved my family," Nathaniel said softly, his slate-gray eyes shining with an emotion so deep and unguarded it took Beatrice's breath away. "And my soul." Beatrice looked up at the fearsome Duke of Roxley, the Wolf of London, and saw only a man who had finally found his equal. "A transaction, Your Grace," Beatrice reminded him, a playful, tearful smile touching her lips. "A matter of survival. I believe those were your terms." Nathaniel let out a rough, joyous laugh. He pulled her into his arms, entirely uncaring of the scandalized gasps erupting around the Prince Regent's ballroom. "To hell with the terms," Nathaniel whispered fiercely before his lips captured hers. "I am going to spend the rest of my life making you realize that choosing you was the only sensible thing this Duke has ever done. If you found yourself captivated by Beatrice's wit and the Duke's dangerous charm, do not let the romance end here. Smash that like button to support more thrilling historical tales. Share this story with your fellow Regency drama lovers, and absolutely remember to subscribe to the channel for more scandalous secrets, midnight rescues, and grand proposals. What would you have done in Beatrice's place? Let us know in the comments below, and we will see you in the next chapter.